The studio lights burned bright, the air heavy with anticipation as the cameras rolled. Mark Levin leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying the same booming authority that had made him a fixture of conservative talk shows. With a sharp, dismissive smirk, he turned his gaze toward Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and delivered the line that would stop the room cold. "Let's be honest," he barked, his tone dripping with contempt. "Your so-called law degree doesn't mean a thing. Anyone can get one these days. It's nothing but paper." The words cracked through the air like a whip. For a moment everything froze. The audience, packed shoulder to shoulder, shifted in stunned disbelief. Some mouths fell open. Others gasped audibly, the sound echoing across the hushed set. Even the moderators, seasoned veterans of political crossfire, glanced at each other as if to say, "Did he really just go there?" Levin reclined, confident, basking in the silence he mistook for victory. He knew his audience well, or so he thought, those who thrived on provocation, who wanted blood on the floor. His eyes narrowed as he awaited the recoil, the stumble, the defensive scramble that so many before had offered under his glare. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes steady. There was no trace of panic, no darting glance toward the cameras, no desperate rush to interrupt. Instead, a calm settled over her like armor, a silence that spoke louder than 1,000 shouted rebuttals. The audience felt it too. The murmurs grew into whispers, an undercurrent of energy that seemed to pulse beneath the studio floor. Some leaned forward, sensing something seismic about to happen. A college student in the back row raised her phone, ready to capture history. Levin's smirk widened, mistaking composure for weakness. He doubled down with a scoff, shaking his head as if dismissing not just a degree but an entire career, an entire identity. His voice rose again, sharper this time, clawing for dominance. But the storm he was summoning was far greater than he realized. Because what came next would not just be a rebuttal. It would be a transformation of the moment itself, a response so sharp, so undeniable that it would echo far beyond the walls of that studio. But no one expected how Jasmine Crockett would answer back. To understand the weight of that moment, one must look beyond the glare of the studio lights and into the deeper battlefield that shaped it. This was never just about a degree, never just about two voices colliding on a stage. It was about the clash of two Americas, one that sought to belittle, diminish, and mock, and another that carried the scars and strength of generations who had fought for a seat at the table. Mark Levin was no ordinary antagonist. For decades, his booming commentary had echoed through right-wing media like a gavel, shaping narratives, weaponizing outrage, and galvanizing millions who tuned in nightly to hear their prejudices confirmed and their anger stoked. He was not merely a pundit. He was an institution. His words had toppled careers, smeared reputations, and left countless opponents reeling under the weight of his sneer. When Levin dismissed Jasmine Crockett's law degree, he was reaching for the same blunt weapon he had used countless times before: humiliation as a tool of dominance. But this time, the target was different. Jasmine Crockett had not stumbled into the spotlight. Her rise had been earned through grueling battles, fighting for justice in courtrooms, standing against voter suppression, and representing voices often drowned out by louder, older, wealthier ones. She embodied something that unsettled Levin and those who cheered him on: a new generation of leadership that carried dignity like a shield and identity like a banner. Her very presence on that stage was a challenge to the gatekeepers of the old order. That is why the air crackled after Levin's insult. The audience understood, perhaps instinctively, that this wasn't just another shouting match on television. It was a referendum on credibility itself. Could dignity hold its ground against arrogance? Could years of earned expertise stand tall against the brute force of mockery? Could a woman of color, armed with intellect and lived experience, silence a man who had built his empire on dismissing both? Millions watching at home felt the stakes in their bones. For immigrant families who had sacrificed everything so their children could pursue degrees once deemed unattainable, Levin's words struck like a slap. For young professionals who had clawed their way through school loans, long nights, and systemic barriers, the insult carried a sting that was personal. And for those who believed in the promise of service, the belief that knowledge and sacrifice mattered more than swagger, the question lingered: would anyone finally hold him accountable? Jasmine Crockett was not only defending herself, she was standing as a proxy for countless Americans whose achievements had been dismissed, whose dignity had been questioned, whose very right to be at the table had been undermined. In her stillness was not weakness. It was the gathering of a storm that carried voices far beyond her own. And yet Levin sat smug, convinced he had landed a blow too sharp to recover from. He misread the silence. He misread the calm. He misread the moment entirely. Because when dignity is dismissed, it does not vanish. It sharpens, it hardens, it prepares. The stage was set, the air electric, the stakes towering higher with every second of silence. And just when viewers thought it was over, Levin doubled down, setting the stage for a takedown heard across America. To understand the venom in Mark Levin's words that night, one must first understand the man himself, a figure both revered and reviled, a voice that had carved itself into the American political soundscape with fire and fury. Levin was not new to confrontation. In fact, confrontation was his oxygen. His rise had been built on the very performance he delivered against Jasmine Crockett: booming authority, razor-edged disdain, and an almost theatrical capacity to belittle. For decades, Levin had fashioned himself as the intellectual bruiser of conservative media. While others cloaked their rhetoric in charm or satire, Levin wielded his temper like a weapon. He shouted, he mocked. He cut his opponents down with a kind of gleeful hostility that thrilled his base and terrified those caught in his crosshairs. In his world, calm was weakness, humility was naivete, and credentials meant little unless they confirmed his worldview. The louder he grew, the more his audience leaned in, mistaking noise for strength, mistaking cruelty for truth. Yet beneath the bluster lay a string of contradictions. Levin himself had once proudly displayed his legal background, building credibility as a constitutional lawyer and former official in the Reagan Justice Department. He held tightly to his own degree when it elevated him, when it opened doors, when it burnished his image as a serious thinker. But when faced with an opponent like Jasmine Crockett, a black woman whose credentials mirrored his own, he wielded that same degree like a cudgel, scoffing at its worth, dismissing it as just paper. It was a pattern as old as his career. Time and again, Levin had used his platform to belittle rather than engage, to sneer rather than debate. He called political opponents morons, clowns, and fools. He accused judges of treachery, journalists of deceit, and activists of subversion. His rants, often punctuated by slamming his fists or raising his voice to a fever pitch, became his trademark. To his supporters, it was catharsis. Here was someone finally telling it like it is. To his critics, it was bullying, plain and simple, a man mistaking volume for victory. And yet his influence could not be denied. His books topped bestseller lists. His radio shows drew millions. His television appearances commanded attention. For years, politicians feared the lash of his tongue, knowing a single segment could unleash a torrent of angry calls, tweets, and headlines. Levin had become less of a commentator and more of an enforcer, the embodiment of a political style that thrived on humiliation and the erasure of nuance. Still, even the sharpest weapons dull when overused. As time passed, Levin's formula began to wear thin. His insults grew predictable, his tirades repetitive. More and more, critics noted that he seemed less interested in persuasion than in domination. And in that desperation to dominate, cracks began to form. This was one of them. In dismissing Crockett's law degree, Levin revealed not strength but fear. Fear of a new generation of leaders rising to challenge him. Fear of women, people of color, and progressives who wielded intellect and experience rather than shouting matches. His contempt was not rooted in reason, but in insecurity, a desperate attempt to guard the old guard from the voices demanding entry. And therein lay the irony. For all his bluster about hard work, discipline, and American grit, Levin had reduced an accomplishment like Crockett's, a degree earned through sacrifice, perseverance, and relentless determination, into nothing more than paper. It was a move that betrayed his own creed. It was hypocrisy laid bare under the glare of studio lights. The audience sensed it. Viewers at home sensed it too. The insult, meant to weaken, instead exposed Levin's fragility. It showed a man so reliant on arrogance that he could no longer recognize dignity when it stared back at him. This is the fate of many who mistake noise for substance. Eventually, their echo drowns out their reason. Levin had built an empire on tearing others down, on dismissing achievements, on mocking dignity. But in Jasmine Crockett, he had met someone who would not bend to his script. His reputation as the great bulldozer of debate had collided with a wall he could not topple. He had unleashed the insult as he had 100 times before, expecting the same result: silence, stammering, retreat. But this time silence was not surrender, it was strategy. Because little did Levin know, his insult had unlocked the very story that would dismantle his attack. Before the studio lights and the national stage, Jasmine Crockett's journey had been forged in places far less glamorous and infinitely more grueling. Her story did not begin with applause or headlines. It began with long nights under dim library lamps, the smell of coffee clinging to her notes, and the weight of expectation pressing heavily against her shoulders. Law school was no gentle climb. It was an unforgiving gauntlet that tested willpower as much as intellect. For Crockett, the challenge was not only academic but personal. She carried the legacy of a family that had sacrificed so much, the echoes of a community that looked at her success as their collective triumph. Every late night spent memorizing statutes, every exam that seemed designed to break spirits, every moment she wondered if she was good enough, those battles carved resilience into her bones. But it wasn't just about earning a degree. It was about what that degree represented. For Crockett, the pursuit of law was not an exercise in prestige. It was a weapon to fight back against injustice. While some saw the legal system as a ladder to wealth, she saw it as a shield for the vulnerable. She was determined to turn knowledge into power, and power into protection for those who needed it most. Her early years as an attorney were anything but easy. She walked into courtrooms where she was often underestimated before she even spoke a word. Judges glanced past her, opposing counsel dismissed her, and juries tilted their heads as if to ask silently, "Can she really stand against this?" Each time, Crockett answered with sharp arguments, meticulous preparation, and an unflinching belief in her clients. She defended those society had tossed aside, the accused, the poor, the voiceless. To them she was more than a lawyer, she was a lifeline. It was in those crucibles that her poise was born. When a prosecutor sneered across the table, she had already learned not to take the bait. When a judge questioned her credibility, she had already prepared to meet skepticism with facts. Every trial was another scar, another layer of armor, and through those scars she became not just a lawyer but a fighter for dignity itself. As her reputation grew, so too did her sense of responsibility. She realized the courtroom was powerful, but its reach was limited. To change laws, to reform systems, to protect communities before injustice even reached the trial stage, she would need to step into a larger arena. That is when politics called. Running for office was no small leap. It meant opening her life to scrutiny, subjecting herself to attacks not just on her record but on her identity. Yet Crockett did not step forward out of vanity. She stepped forward because she had seen, up close, the real consequences of neglect. She had seen the young man jailed for lack of resources, the grandmother stripped of her vote, the family torn apart because the law looked the other way. She knew that silence was complicity, and she refused to be silent. In Congress, she quickly became known as a sharp mind with a sharper tongue, unafraid to confront those who sought to drag the country backward. Her speeches carried the cadence of lived struggle, her questions cut through rehearsed talking points, and her presence became a reminder that the halls of power were not reserved for the privileged alone. She stood as proof that grit, sacrifice, and community could produce leaders just as capable, if not more so, than the dynasties of wealth and entitlement. It is this history that made her so uniquely prepared for Levin's insult, because long before a pundit tried to dismiss her law degree, others had tried to dismiss her very place in the world. Long before Levin mocked her credentials, others had mocked her presence in courtrooms and legislative chambers. And long before Levin attempted to strip her dignity, others had tried to deny it outright. Each time, Crockett had chosen not to crumble but to rise, to turn their dismissal into fuel. So when she sat under those blinding lights, listening to Levin scoff, her silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of calculation, of strength, of someone who knew that words spoken in anger are often weaker than words spoken with purpose. Behind her stillness was a lifetime of battles, law school exams that nearly broke her, clients who had cried on her shoulder, campaigns fought with sweat and sacrifice. The audience could not see it, but in that moment, Jasmine Crockett was not alone at that table. She carried her community with her. She carried every young woman told she wasn't enough, every student who doubted their worth, every immigrant family who had crossed oceans believing that education and service could still mean something in America. And when Levin struck, Crockett didn't flinch. She drew on every battle she had ever fought. The air inside the studio had shifted. What began as a single insult now swelled into something far larger, a duel of wills that drew every eye and ear into its orbit. Mark Levin, emboldened by the weight of his own voice, leaned harder into his attack. His words came faster, louder, sharper, each sentence designed not to persuade but to dominate. "Spare us the theatrics," he sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. "You sit here waving a degree around like it makes you special. It doesn't. I've seen kids fresh out of mediocre schools parade the same credentials. It doesn't make you smart. It doesn't make you credible. It certainly doesn't make you right." The volume of his tirade rattled the microphones. His hands slashed the air, his eyes narrowed into daggers. This was the Levin formula: smother the room with noise, leave no space for an opponent to breathe, and force the audience to mistake ferocity for truth. But Crockett did not rise to his tempo. She sat as she had from the beginning, composed. Her posture did not waver. Her hands remained still. The only movement was in her eyes, steady, unblinking, piercing through Levin's storm as though measuring it, weighing it, waiting for the right moment. The contrast was striking. On one side, chaos, volume, and arrogance. On the other, calm, steadiness, and quiet authority. The audience felt the polarity like a current humming between them. Some shifted uneasily, sensing the imbalance. Others leaned forward, their anticipation growing with each second Crockett refused to take Levin's bait. Levin mistook her composure for hesitation. His voice climbed higher. "Tell me," he jeered, his words spitting like sparks, "how many cases did you really win? How many times were you taken seriously? You and your so-called degree are nothing compared to decades of real scholarship, of real thought leaders, of real patriots who actually built this country." The last phrase echoed, bouncing off the studio walls, swelling with a self-importance so inflated that even his allies in the room shifted awkwardly in their seats. But Levin was too locked in his fury to notice. He believed his performance was breaking her down, chipping away at her resolve. Still, Crockett did not move. Her silence was not weakness, it was strategy. The audience began to sense it, the same way one senses the air tightening before a storm breaks. Phones were already raised in the audience, recording, streaming, capturing every second. Twitter hashtags were forming in real time. Viewers at home could feel the tension coil tighter with every pause she allowed to hang unanswered. And then Levin went too far. He leaned in close, lowering his voice not out of respect but to land the insult like a dagger. "You're a fraud. he said coldly. "A degree doesn't make you worthy of respect, and deep down you know it." Gasps erupted from the audience. Even the moderators froze, their eyes darting from Levin to Crockett, wondering if the night had just tipped past the point of recovery. Levin sat back, convinced he had delivered the finishing blow. But what he didn't understand, what he had never understood, was that Crockett had been here before. She had faced louder voices, deeper skepticism, sharper attacks, and each time she had risen not with noise but with truth. The studio's silence stretched long, every heartbeat audible. Crockett's lips parted slowly, deliberately, as the anticipation in the room reached its breaking point. Then, with the nation watching, Crockett delivered the words that no one, not even Levin, could recover from. Jasmine Crockett let the silence linger, stretching it just long enough to make the audience squirm in their seats. The cameras zoomed closer, catching every flicker of her expression. Her composure was unbroken, her breathing even, her gaze unwavering. For a long moment she looked at Mark Levin, not with anger, not with fear, but with a kind of patient disappointment, the way a teacher might regard a student who had confused arrogance with intelligence. Then she spoke, her voice steady and deliberate, each word dropping like a stone into the still water of the studio. "You call my law degree nothing but paper," she began, her tone low but commanding. "But that piece of paper is more than parchment and ink. It represents years of sacrifice. It represents nights I went without sleep, days I went without rest, and moments I questioned whether I could carry the weight of what I was trying to build. That degree isn't just paper, it's proof. Proof of perseverance. Proof of grit. Proof that in this country, if you're willing to fight hard enough, you can break through walls built to keep you out." The audience stirred. A ripple of applause broke out from one corner, quickly silenced by the moderators, but it was enough to shift the energy. Levin's smirk faltered just slightly, his jaw tightening as he realized her calm wasn't weakness, it was preparation. Crockett leaned forward now, her words gaining momentum. "You ask how many cases I've won. Let me tell you something. I've stood in courtrooms where my clients couldn't afford hope, let alone a defense. I've argued for men and women who were written off by society before they ever had their day in court. And I won, not because I was the loudest voice in the room, but because I knew the law, I respected it, and I used it to protect people who had no one else to stand for them. That's what this so-called paper gave me, the ability to turn silence into justice." Gasps of approval rippled through the audience. Someone shouted, "That's right," from the back, and this time the applause rose louder, uncontainable. The moderators hesitated, but the tide of the room was turning, and even they knew it. Levin shifted in his chair, his face tightening. He tried to interject, but Crockett raised a hand, not in anger but in authority. The gesture froze him mid-breath. "You see, Mr. Levin," she continued, "you built your career belittling people like me. You speak of patriotism while tearing down the very values that built this country, the idea that merit, sacrifice, and service matter. But here's the difference between us. You use your voice to attack, I use mine to defend. You've made a living shouting at people. I've made a living standing for them. You wave your resume as a weapon. I wear mine as a responsibility." The crowd roared, unable to restrain themselves any longer. Applause thundered through the studio, cameras catching the eruption as it swept across the audience. Levin's eyes darted nervously, his practiced confidence cracking under the weight of the moment. Crockett let the applause roll before she spoke again, this time slower, each pause deliberate, each phrase meant to pierce deeper. "You tell me I'm not worthy of respect. Let me remind you, respect is not earned by volume, it's earned by service. Respect isn't about who can shout the loudest, it's about who shows up when it matters, who fights for those who can't fight for themselves, who sacrifices comfort for the sake of justice. That's what my degree represents. That's what my career represents. And that's what I represent." The room was electric now. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even shouting Crockett's name. Levin sat stone-faced, the energy draining from him as quickly as it poured into her. His bluster had met its immovable wall, and that wall had answered back with dignity and fire. But Crockett wasn't done. She leaned in, her voice dropping just enough to force everyone to listen. "And let's not forget," she said softly, almost like a confidant sharing a secret, "you, Mr. Levin, also have a law degree. You've used it to elevate yourself, to prop up your voice, to gain credibility in rooms you might not otherwise enter. You want us to believe a degree is worthless, yet you built your empire on the very credibility it gave you. So which is it? Is a law degree meaningless, or is it only meaningless when it belongs to someone like me?" The words landed like thunder. A collective gasp swept across the studio, followed by a silence so sharp it seemed to cut the air. Levin opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The hypocrisy had been laid bare, exposed under the spotlight, undeniable and unspinnable. Crockett seized the silence. "My degree doesn't just hang on a wall, it lives in the work I do. It lives in the families I've defended, the communities I've served, and the laws I've fought to uphold. You can insult the paper all you want, but you cannot erase the lives changed by the person who earned it. You cannot erase the battles I've fought and the victories I've won, not for myself, but for those who deserved a champion." The audience leapt to their feet, the ovation deafening now. Some clapped through tears, others cheered so loudly their voices cracked. The cameras caught it all, the wave of validation, the cathartic release of watching arrogance finally dismantled by truth. Levin sat back, shoulders sagging, eyes darting anywhere but toward Crockett. For once, the great bulldozer of debate had no rebuttal, no retort, no sneer to hide behind. He had been cornered not by volume but by truth spoken with precision and conviction. Crockett waited for the cheers to settle, then delivered the final line, her voice strong and unshakable. "You say my law degree is nothing but paper. But let me tell you this, paper burns, but the truth written on it endures. My degree is not my power, my service is. And no insult, no sneer, no outburst will ever erase that." The crowd erupted once more, this time so thunderous that the walls themselves seemed to tremble. People rose from their seats, clapping, shouting, chanting her name. On social media, clips of her takedown were already flooding timelines, hashtags exploding into the digital ether. Mark Levin, once so towering in his bluster, sat diminished, a man undone not by another loud voice, but by the quiet, unshakable force of dignity turned into fire. The moment was sealed, unforgettable, a mic drop not of volume but of truth. The fallout was immediate, and it spread far beyond the debate stage. The debate had ended, but the story was only beginning. Within minutes, the internet erupted like a dam breaking. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, every platform became a flood of reactions, each one magnifying the force of Jasmine Crockett's counterattack. Hashtags shot to the top of the trending charts: Crockett clapback, paper with power, Levin exposed. The clip of her final line, "Paper burns, but the truth endures," was replayed in countless edits, stitched into videos with flashing text, dramatic music, even memes that spread faster than anyone could track. Law students were among the first to seize the moment. Professors retweeted the exchange with comments like, "This is why we teach not just law but courage." Students posted selfies holding their own degrees, writing captions such as, "This isn't just paper either." Across the country, law school libraries buzzed, not with case briefs, but with pride. It was as though Crockett had spoken directly to them, validating every sleepless night, every sacrifice they had poured into the pursuit of justice. Civil rights leaders joined the chorus, framing the moment as bigger than a debate clapback. Reverend Al Sharpton called it a masterclass in turning insult into inspiration. Angela Davis, long a voice for resilience and truth, shared the clip with a single word: respect. Younger activists wove Crockett's words into rallying cries, merging them with ongoing campaigns about equity, dignity, and representation. And then came the celebrities. Ava DuVernay posted the clip with the caption, "That's how you turn a stage into a platform." Kerry Washington shared it with a fire emoji and wrote, "Protect Jasmine Crockett at all costs." Even LeBron James weighed in, tweeting to his millions of followers, "When you know your worth, nobody can take it away. Salute." Mark Levin's defenders scrambled to respond, but their rebuttals were drowned in the noise. Attempts to spin Crockett's answer as scripted or over-rehearsed fell flat against the authenticity of her delivery. Viewers didn't see a staged moment. They saw lived truth, sharpened by years of battle, striking precisely when it mattered most. Cable news channels played the clip on repeat. Anchors dissected every pause, every phrase, every gesture. Some called it the turning point of the night. Others compared it to the great political takedowns of history, the moments that transcend the stage and etch themselves into public memory. Editorials followed, declaring Crockett's reply not just a defense of her own honor, but a rebuke of the arrogance and dismissiveness that had defined Levin's brand for years. But it wasn't just commentators who felt the impact. It was ordinary people. A young immigrant mother in Texas wrote on Facebook, "My daughter wants to be a lawyer. Tonight she watched someone who looks like her shut down the man who said she wasn't enough. I cried." In Detroit, a group of community organizers replayed the clip during a meeting, breaking into applause as though they were in the studio audience themselves. Even memes became part of the validation. One viral image showed Levin with the caption, "When you bring a smirk to a truth fight." Another displayed Crockett holding invisible papers, with text reading, "Not just paper, power." Humor carried the weight of the moment further than speeches ever could. The speed of the reaction was staggering. Overnight, Crockett gained hundreds of thousands of new followers across social media. Her campaign donation page crashed from traffic. Political analysts remarked on the sudden swell of grassroots energy around her name, calling it the Crockett Surge. What had begun as a routine debate exchange had transformed into a cultural flashpoint. For Levin, the fallout was brutal. Clips of his silent, stunned expression circulated just as widely as Crockett's words. He became the meme, the punchline, the face of arrogance deflated. His supporters tried to rally, but the momentum wasn't theirs to command anymore. And beneath the noise, something deeper was taking shape. This wasn't just about Crockett's comeback or Levin's embarrassment. It was about what the moment revealed, about whose voices were being dismissed and whose truth had the power to rise. It was about the dignity of work, the resilience of sacrifice, and the audacity to claim respect in the face of condescension. The shockwaves kept rolling, picking up speed, carrying Crockett's words far beyond the debate stage. And as the noise grew, a deeper lesson emerged, one that could not be ignored. When the dust of the debate finally settled, Jasmine Crockett stood not merely as a politician who had defended herself, but as a symbol of something greater. She had turned an insult, cold, cutting, meant to diminish, into a declaration of empowerment that resonated across living rooms, classrooms, and community halls. In her closing remarks, she refused to let Levin's words linger as wounds. Instead, she reframed them as a challenge, one she was proud to meet. "Yes, a law degree is paper," she said, her voice steady, clear, and unyielding. "But paper is where justice begins. It is where laws are written, where rights are defended, where change is signed into reality. It is not the paper that matters. It is the service behind it, the sacrifices it represents, the people it protects." The audience erupted again, not in shock this time, but in recognition. They weren't just applauding her credentials. They were applauding their own struggles, their own late nights, their own battles to be taken seriously in a world too quick to dismiss them. Crockett had given voice to something they felt but rarely heard articulated so powerfully, that dignity and perseverance weigh more than arrogance and noise. She reminded viewers that her degree wasn't won in isolation. It had been carved from years of study while juggling jobs, from showing up in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients, from fighting not for prestige but for people. "A piece of paper may not mean much to those who inherit privilege," she declared. "But to those of us who had to earn every inch, it is proof. Proof that we did not break. Proof that we carried on. proof that we are still here. Her words echoed far beyond the studio. For first-generation students, it was a validation of sacrifice. For immigrants, it was a testament to perseverance. For anyone who had been dismissed because of their background, their accent, or their skin color, it was a reminder that arrogance can shout, but it cannot erase truth. Levin's bluster now seemed small, loud, yes, but hollow. Crockett's calm precision had turned the tables entirely. She didn't just win a debate, she showed what real strength looks like. Not the kind measured in decibels, but the kind measured in courage. Not the kind that seeks to humiliate, but the kind that seeks to uplift. The moral was unmistakable. Paper may crumble, insults may fade, but dignity, earned through perseverance and lived service, endures. Crockett had demonstrated that resilience is more powerful than ridicule, and that truth, when spoken with clarity and conviction, will always outlast arrogance. And as her final words settled into the silence, she delivered the reflection that would etch this moment into history. Because in the end, America remembers not the loudest voices, but the strongest truths. And so the story comes full circle. What began with arrogance, Mark Levin dismissing Jasmine Crockett's law degree as just paper, ended with dignity, poise, and a truth that could not be denied. Levin raised his voice, but Crockett raised the standard. He tried to belittle her, but she transformed his insult into a lesson for every American watching, that credentials are not vanity, but validation of sacrifice, service, and strength. It was more than a clash between two people. It was a reflection of two visions of America, one rooted in arrogance and dismissal, the other in dignity and perseverance. Crockett showed that the calm voice of truth can silence even the loudest storms of contempt. And that's why this moment will be remembered, not for the insult that tried to define it, but for the courage that redefined it. Now the question turns to us. What do we do with moments like these? Do we let them pass as entertainment, or do we use them as inspiration? Do we scroll by, or do we stand up and say, "This is the America we want to see, an America where dignity wins"? If you believe in standing up to arrogance with dignity, hit subscribe and share this story. Because voices like Jasmine Crockett's don't just deserve to be heard, they need to be heard. Your support helps ensure that when truth speaks, it carries further, reaches deeper, and inspires more people to believe in their own worth. This isn't just a channel, it's a movement. And together, we can make sure that the strongest truths are never drowned out by the loudest noise.